Good morning. This young bloke walked into the office one day and he was talking to the volunteer out in the outer office part. I could hear bits of the words, food, help, whatever. And it went on for a bit, and then she came in and said, look, can you come and help this guy? I don't know what to do, how to help him. So I took him into the office. He was neat, but his clothes were worn and older, and he looked tired and weary and exhausted, anxious, desperate. I said, hey mate, do you want a coffee or tea? He said, yeah, and told me how to make it. So I went and made a couple of coffees and got a plate of biscuits and cake, whatever I could find in the kitchen, and put them down in front of him, and he drank the coffee, but he was a bit, I said, go help yourself. And I had one just to break the tension. And he started eating the biscuits and cake, and he swallowed them and the coffee, and I said, you want another one? And he said, could I? So I went and made another coffee and replenished the plate of biscuits and cake, and he swallowed them too. And when he'd finished, he looked more with it. His eyes looked clearer. His speech was clearer and less rambling. He was hungry and he needed some food. I mean, it wasn't great food, nutritious, but it was food. It would fuel his brain and give him some energy, and he was able to talk. So I said to him, mate, tell us your story. What's happening? In the next half an hour or so, he told me a story that was dark and deep and difficult. A story that had gone on for some time. A story of loneliness and abuse and violence growing up. A story of exclusion and fear and uncertainty, and the darkness of drugs and addiction and hiding from the pain and experiencing more desperation and pain with the addictions and the drugs, and then getting clean, finally getting clean, but of thinking back and experiencing the shame and the regret and wish it could be different, and the yearning for life and freedom and something new and what we all dream of and want. And when he finished sharing his story, I said, what is it you need? What can we help you with? His biggest, most desperate need was food. He was hungry. He was hungry. I said, no worries, we can help you. What else? And he listed off these needs that were complex and difficult. Some I could start to help him with, but most were too big for me to deal with in that moment. I went and got him some food, a couple of weeks' worth of groceries from the pantry we had. Gave him some names and addresses and phone numbers of people that could help with some of the bigger things, organisations. And then I offered a prayer, a blessing, naming him as beloved of God, holding his story and his experience with dignity and respect, and naming his resilience and courage, not only to get through that, but to share his story. I don't know what that time meant for him, whether it meant as much for him as it did for me. Looking back, it was kind of a sacrament, that the bread and the coffee were like Holy Communion. And God was present as he shared intimately this story of pain and struggle and challenge. I thought of that story as I read the beginnings of this long and meandering story that John tells in chapter 6, one that we'll look at over the next few weeks. Stories of hunger and bread and life and the different layers and levels of hunger, body, mind and spirit. Of the story of this young man whose hunger was in his body, but there were other hungers for drugs and escape and release that he'd experienced that led only into deeper darkness. The hunger he had now that wasn't just for food, but for freedom and for new life and for a new way of being in the world. Hungers that we all have. And Jesus and the disciples are on a mountain looking for some quiet space, but the crowds find them and come. And Jesus looks up and sees this crowd of 5,000 plus people. And he says to Philip, one of the disciples, how are we going to feed this mob? And Philip is taken aback. 6 months' wages wouldn't be enough to feed them. He says, what are you on about? And then Andrew comes up, and another disciple, he's got a boy's lunch, a few barley rolls, 5 barley rolls and some fish, the food of poor people. And Jesus said, look, sit them down in groups. And he took these barley rolls, and I don't know whether there was other offerings as well, but it names the 5 rolls and fish, and he blesses them, and he breaks them, and he breaks them, and he breaks them, and he breaks them. And as he breaks them, they're given out to the people, and the people eat. And there's enough food for everyone. And there's 12 basketfuls left over. This is a story of the people of God that are fed, that their bellies are full. It says that this is the time of Passover. And these people aren't down or journeying down to Jerusalem where the major celebration will be, the religious stuff happens. These are out in the wilderness. These are common people. And they're seeking meaning not there in the holy city, but here in the presence of Jesus, seeking freedom and life that he obviously offers. They come to him. And this is like a Passover meal. And it's probably closer to the real thing, that real Passover meal that celebrated the liberation that Moses and the people experienced. Coming out of Egypt as slaves, crossing the Red Sea, the barrier, being pursued by the Egyptian armies. You know those great stories. Going up the mountain and getting the laws, this covenant that makes them a new people under God, a new way of living and being in the world. And then the wilderness wanderings, where they experience the challenges and the formation into a community. And they're hungry and they're thirsty and they cry out and they complain, and God provides this food, this bread on the morning dew that's formed into a flour and cooked up into bread. That's what it's reminiscent of. It's also reminiscent of Elisha, who takes barley rolls and breaks them and feeds a few hundred people. Not this big crowd, but... And John is harking back to these stories of their tradition. And these people are looking for life and hope. And they find it in Jesus, who will go on to speak in a deeper way about hunger and life and being. And then the second part of the story this week, the crowds disperse and go home, and Jesus sends the disciples across the lake in their boats. And as they go, the darkness descends, and it says that the waves and the wind, the storm awakens on the lake. And the little boats are thrown around and they row through the storm. And then they see coming over these waves this figure, and they're afraid. And he says, don't be afraid, it's only me. And this Jesus figure, this Christ figure, walks to them across the waves, across the sea of their lives, the lives that are in darkness and storm, that are thrown about. Jesus comes to them. The Christ comes to them in the midst of the storms and offers them peace. In the midst of this young man's life, tossed and turned and finding new paths, I wonder if he experienced the grace of God in that moment. In that sacrament of sharing his story, of God being present, of sharing the food and the blessing. I don't know even what happened to him. I didn't see him again. I don't know whether he came in to get more food and help when I wasn't there, or went off to some of these other agencies and organisations that could provide bigger forms of support. But I pray for him and others like him that have come seeking a new way, a new life, who need physical food for their belly, who need clothes, or they need practical support for their lives. And once they get that, need the deeper hope and life of spirit and being, the life that God offers, and that we'll hear more about in this story from John. Where is God in your life? The Spirit. What are the hungers you have? Not just the hunger of the belly, but the other sorts of hungers that challenge you and come to you. This man had hungers for drugs in his previous days. A hunger so deep that it took over his life, this addiction. And it took a lot to break it. It was a bad hunger. What are the good hungers and the bad hungers in your life? What do you yearn for in your deepest being? What are the deepest prayers of your heart?